My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I thought I knew everything about my mother, Eleanor. She raised me and my brother Jake as a single mother after our father left when I was 7. She worked 2 jobs, never complained, and always made our birthdays special despite having little money. Mom passed away suddenly at 68 from a heart attack. One day she was tending her garden in suburban Cleveland. The next day she was gone. The funeral was small, but filled with people whose lives she had touched: neighbors, co-workers from the factory, and close friends. Jake and I spent the week after the funeral going through Mum's belongings. The modest ranch house held memories and the accumulated possessions of a woman who never threw anything away because she'd grown up during the Depression. The process was emotionally exhausting. We found boxes of our school papers, photo albums documenting every milestone, and drawers full of items that seemed insignificant but must have held meaning for her. Jake focused on paperwork and valuable items, while I got lost in sentimental artifacts. During this process, I remembered Mom's old toolbox. She'd always been handy around the house, fixing leaky faucets and squeaky hinges with the confidence of someone who'd learned you couldn't afford to pay someone else for what you could figure out yourself. The red metal toolbox sat on a basement shelf, covered in dust and paint splatters. I almost overlooked it entirely, but something made me decide to bring it upstairs and go through it one last time before donating it to charity. Chapter 2. The Discovery. The toolbox was heavier than I remembered, filled with well-used tools and debris from countless repair projects. I set it on the kitchen table where Mom and I had shared so many conversations and carefully lifted the lid. The familiar smell of WD-40 and metal polish brought back memories. The top tray contained screwdrivers, pliers, and small hardware. I lifted it out to examine the lower compartment, expecting larger tools and spare parts. Instead, wedged beneath a hammer and wrapped in an old dish towel, I found something unexpected: a manila envelope with my name written in Mom's careful handwriting. The envelope was sealed and appeared undisturbed for years. My hands trembled as I opened it, wondering what message Mom might have left in such an unusual hiding place. Inside, I found a handwritten letter and several official-looking documents. The letter was dated 3 months before Mom's death, written in blue ink. The handwriting was shakier than I remembered, perhaps reflecting the heart problems that would claim her life. As I began to read, I felt the comfort of hearing her voice, but the content would shatter everything I thought I knew. "My dearest Sarah," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've found what I've been keeping from you for 31 years. I know this will come as a shock, and I pray you'll forgive me for the secrets I've kept. There are things about your father that I never told you, not because I wanted to hurt you, but because I was trying to protect you from a truth I thought was too painful to bear." I stopped reading, my heart pounding as I realized that everything I thought I knew about my father's abandonment might have been a lie. Chapter 3. The Truth About Dad. I forced myself to continue reading, even though each sentence reshaped my understanding of our family's history. Mom's letter continued with details that made my chest tighten with confusion and anger. "Your father didn't leave because he stopped loving us," the letter explained. "He left because he loved us too much to stay. Robert was struggling with mental illness that was getting worse each year. The doctors called it bipolar disorder, but back then we didn't have the medications or understanding that might have helped him." The letter described episodes of erratic behavior that I had vague memories of but never understood. Dad's sudden mood swings, his disappearances for days, and the arguments I'd heard through bedroom walls suddenly made sense in a different context. Mom had been protecting us from seeing our father's illness. The night he left, Robert had what the doctors called a psychotic break, Mom wrote. He became convinced that he was dangerous to you and Jake, that his presence would somehow harm you. No amount of reasoning could convince him otherwise. He packed a bag and disappeared, leaving only a note saying that he loved us too much to hurt us anymore. My hands shook as I read the next part. Mom had spent years trying to find Dad, hiring private investigators and following every lead. She'd discovered that he'd been living on the streets in various cities, unable to hold a job due to his untreated mental illness. She'd found him twice and tried to convince him to come home, but each time he'd insisted that staying away was the only way to keep us safe. The documents supported Mom's story. There were hospital records showing Dad's psychiatric evaluations, reports from private investigators, and correspondence with social services agencies. Most heartbreaking were several letters that Dad had written to Mom over the years. Letters he'd sent, but asked her never to share with us because he didn't want us to remember him as broken. Chapter 4. The letters from Dad. Among the documents were 12 letters that Dad had written to Mom over 15 years. Each one was carefully preserved in its original envelope, postmarked from different cities. Reading them felt like discovering a ghost, hearing the voice of the man I'd idealized and demonized throughout my life. The earliest letter was postmarked 6 months after he'd left us. His handwriting was erratic, and the content revealed a man struggling with paranoia and delusions, but still desperately concerned about his family's welfare. He asked about Jake and me, whether we were doing well in school, if we had enough to eat. He insisted that Mom should tell us he was dead rather than explain his mental illness. "I won't let my broken mind poison their memories of what a father should be," he wrote. "Better they think I was weak and abandoned them than know I'm crazy and could hurt them." The subsequent letters showed a pattern of Dad getting help, stabilizing, then losing touch with reality again. There were periods where his writing was clear and coherent, where he expressed regret for leaving and asked about treatment that might make it safe to return. But these hopeful interludes were followed by letters written during psychotic episodes. Mom had responded to every letter. Her copies revealed a woman trying to maintain connection with the man she loved while respecting his wishes to stay away from his children. She'd sent photos of Jake and me, updates about our achievements, and constant reassurances that we were safe and loved. The last letter was dated just 5 years ago, much more recent than I'd expected. Dad's handwriting had become shakier, but his message was clearer. He'd found stable housing in a group home for adults with mental illness and was taking medication that helped control his symptoms. For the first time in decades, he sounded hopeful about possibly having contact with his children. But Mom's letter revealed she'd been too afraid to tell us about this development, worried we might be hurt again if Dad's condition deteriorated. Chapter 5. Mom's impossible choice. Reading further, I began to understand the impossible position Mom had been in for 30 years. Every decision she'd made had been an attempt to balance protecting us from pain while honoring Dad's wishes and maintaining connection to the man she'd never stopped loving. "I know you must be angry that I kept this from you," Mom wrote. "But every choice I made was guided by love. Love for you and Jake, and love for your father who was suffering in ways I couldn't heal. When you were children, I thought it was kinder to let you believe he'd simply left rather than explain mental illness that I barely understood myself." The letter described financial struggles I'd been vaguely aware of but never fully appreciated. What I hadn't known was that she'd regularly sent money to Dad when she could spare it, often going without necessities to ensure he had something to help him survive on the streets. Mom had consulted with therapists and social workers about whether to tell us the truth. The advice was mixed. Some professionals encouraged honesty regardless of our ages, while others warned that the truth might be more traumatic than the fiction we'd been living with. "There were so many times I almost told you," the letter continued. "When you graduated high school and asked why Dad couldn't be there. When you got married and wondered what kind of man abandons his family. When you had your first child and said you couldn't understand how a parent could just walk away. Each time I started to explain. But then I'd see how well you were doing despite everything." The letter revealed that Mom had been in regular contact with Dad's social worker at the group home. She'd been getting updates on his condition and had even been considering arranging a meeting. But her own health problems had interfered with those plans. Reading this, I felt grief for the father I'd never really known, anger at the deception, and profound sadness for the burden Mom had carried alone. Chapter 6. The current address. Near the end of Mom's letter was information that made my heart race. Dad was still alive, still living in the same group home where he'd been for 7 years. The letter included the address, phone number, and his social worker's name, along with Mom's thoughts about whether Jake and I should attempt contact. "Your father is now 72 years old," Mom wrote. "According to his social worker, the medications have helped stabilize his condition significantly. He's still not the man you remember from early childhood, and he may never be. But he's no longer the tormented soul who felt he had to stay away to protect you." The group home was in Portland, Oregon, nearly 2,000 miles from Cleveland. The distance seemed symbolic of the gap that mental illness had created in our family. But the fact that Dad was alive, stable, and potentially open to contact felt like a miracle I wasn't sure I was ready to handle. Mom's letter included practical information about Dad's current state. He had diabetes and heart problems, common for someone his age who'd lived rough for many years. His memory was somewhat affected by decades of untreated mental illness and current medications, but he was generally coherent and able to live semi-independently. Most importantly, Mom revealed that Dad still asked about Jake and me during conversations with the social worker. He'd kept the photos Mom had sent over the years and apparently talked about us regularly, expressing pride in our accomplishments and regret that his illness had cost him the chance to be part of our lives. "He knows he missed your wedding, Sarah, and he cried when I sent him the photos," Mom wrote. "He knows he has a granddaughter he's never met, and he understands that his choices, however necessary they seemed at the time, have consequences that can't be undone." The letter ended with Mom's final thoughts about whether I should contact Dad, leaving the decision in my hands. Chapter 7. Processing the revelation. I spent the rest of that day in emotional shock, reading and rereading Mom's letter and the documents. Everything I thought I knew about my family had been turned upside down, and I struggled to process the implications. My anger toward Dad, which had been a constant companion for most of my adult life, began to transform into something more complex. The narrative I'd constructed, of a selfish man who abandoned his responsibilities because family life became inconvenient, dissolved in the face of evidence that he'd left because he was genuinely convinced his presence would harm us. At the same time, I felt betrayed by Mom's decision to keep the truth from me for so long. I understood her reasoning, but I couldn't help wondering how different my life might have been if I'd grown up knowing that Dad was sick rather than simply absent. The discovery made me reevaluate Mom's behavior throughout my childhood and adult life. Her reluctance to date other men, which I'd attributed to general wariness about relationships, now made sense as loyalty to a husband who was struggling but not gone. Her occasional unexplained absences and financial stress had new context. Jake's reaction when I called was initial disbelief, followed by his own complex emotional processing. He'd handled Dad's apparent abandonment differently than I had, choosing to focus on the family we'd had rather than the parent we'd lost. Learning that Dad hadn't chosen to leave, but had been driven away by illness, challenged his coping mechanisms. We spent hours on the phone that night, sharing memories and trying to reinterpret our childhood experiences through this new lens. Some things made more sense now. Dad's erratic behavior before he left, Mom's occasional tears, her fierce independence. The question that loomed over everything was whether we should contact Dad, and if so, how to approach a relationship with someone who was essentially a stranger, despite being our father. Chapter 8. The decision to reach out. After 2 weeks of internal debate and long conversations with Jake, I decided to contact Dad's social worker to learn more about his current situation before making any decision about direct contact. The social worker, Patricia Rodriguez, was kind but cautious when I explained who I was. Patricia confirmed most of what Mom's letter had revealed about Dad's condition and living situation. He'd been at the group home for 7 years and had become one of their success stories. Someone who'd achieved stability after decades of homelessness and untreated mental illness. His medication controlled most symptoms, though he still had occasional episodes of anxiety and depression. "Your father talks about you and your brother often," Patricia told me. "He's very proud of both of you, though he carries a lot of guilt about the years he missed. He's expressed interest in making contact, but he's also terrified that you'll reject him or that his presence might somehow cause you harm." Patricia explained that Dad had been working with a therapist to process his feelings about his family and mental illness. The therapy had helped him understand that his decision to leave, while motivated by love, had also caused pain he couldn't undo. He'd reached a point where he wanted to try to repair the relationship if possible. Jake and I decided to proceed slowly. We started by writing a letter to Dad through Patricia, introducing ourselves as his adult children and expressing our desire to understand what had happened to our family. We kept the initial letter simple, sharing basic information about our lives and asking if he would be comfortable with ongoing correspondence. The response came within a week. Dad had dictated a letter to Patricia, who'd written it down and mailed it to us. His words were simple but profound. "I never stopped loving you, and I never stopped hoping that someday you might forgive me for leaving. I understand if you can't, but I want you to know that you have been in my heart every day for 31 years. Chapter 9. Building a bridge across time. The letter exchange between Dad and us continued for several months, with Patricia serving as an intermediary when needed. Each letter revealed more about the man our father had become and the experiences that had shaped his life since leaving us. Dad's letters were heart-wrenching in their honesty. He described years of living on the streets, struggling with paranoia and delusions that made it impossible to maintain employment or stable housing. He wrote about the constant fear that he might hurt innocent people, a fear that his illness had magnified into overwhelming certainty. But he also shared stories of kindness he'd encountered, social workers who'd helped him find temporary shelter, fellow homeless individuals who'd shared food and companionship, and eventually medical professionals who'd helped him understand his condition and find effective treatment. Through these letters, I began to see Dad not as the figure from my childhood memories or the abandoning parent of my angry fantasies, but as a complex person who'd been dealt an incredibly difficult hand and had done his best to protect the people he loved from the chaos in his mind. Jake and I also shared our stories with Dad, our achievements, struggles, families, and careers. I told him about my daughter Emma, now 5 years old, and included photos that showed how much she looked like the pictures Mom had kept of me at that age. Jake wrote about his work as an engineer and his recent marriage. Dad's responses revealed a father's pride. The distance and time hadn't diminished. He asked thoughtful questions about our lives and expressed regret for the milestones he'd missed. But he also celebrated our successes and seemed genuinely happy that we'd built good lives despite his absence. The correspondence was healing in ways I hadn't expected. I found myself looking forward to Dad's letters and feeling a connection to him that I'd thought was impossible after so many years of anger and resentment. Chapter 10. Planning the visit. After 6 months of letter exchanges, Jake and I decided we were ready to meet Dad in person. Patricia helped us plan a visit that would be emotionally manageable for everyone involved, including Dad, who was both excited and terrified about seeing his children after 31 years. The group home where Dad lived was a converted Victorian house in a quiet Portland neighborhood. It housed 8 adults with various mental health conditions who needed some support but could live semi-independently. Patricia gave us a tour before we met Dad, explaining the structure and support systems that had helped him achieve stability. Dad was waiting for us in the common living room, and I was struck by how much he'd aged since my childhood memories. He was thin and moved slowly, the result of decades of poor nutrition and limited health care. But his eyes were clear and alert, and when he saw us, his face lit up with unmistakable joy. The initial conversation was awkward, as we all struggled to bridge the enormous gap between the people we'd been when he left and who we'd become. Dad seemed overwhelmed by seeing us as adults, frequently commenting on how much we'd grown and changed. Jake and I were processing the reality of seeing our father as an elderly man with obvious health problems. But gradually the conversation became easier. Dad asked about our lives with genuine interest, and we found ourselves sharing stories and memories that helped rebuild some sense of connection. He was particularly interested in hearing about Emma, his granddaughter, and looked through every photo I'd brought with intensity. The visit lasted 3 hours, and by the end, we'd established that we wanted to continue building a relationship. Dad was cautious about not wanting to disrupt our lives or create unrealistic expectations, but he was clearly grateful for the opportunity to reconnect with his children. We made plans to visit again in a few months and to continue our letter correspondence in the meantime. Chapter 11. Introducing Emma to her grandfather. 6 months after our first visit, I made the decision to bring Emma to meet her grandfather. At 5 years old, she was old enough to understand that this was a special person, but young enough to accept the situation without the complicated emotions that Jake and I had been processing. I'd prepared Emma by explaining that Grandpa Robert had been sick for a long time and hadn't been able to visit us, but that he was feeling better now and wanted to meet her. She accepted this explanation with the matter-of-fact way that children handle information adults find emotionally complex. Dad's reaction to meeting Emma was profound. I watched this elderly man who'd been convinced for decades that his presence would somehow harm his family interact with his granddaughter with a gentleness that revealed the father he might have been if mental illness hadn't intervened. Emma simply saw a kind older man who was interested in her drawings and stories. The visit was designed around Emma's attention span and need for routine. But watching Dad and Emma together, I saw glimpses of the family relationships that mental illness had stolen from all of us. Emma showed Dad her favorite books, and he listened to her read with patience and attention. Dad asked if he could give Emma a small gift he'd prepared, a wooden puzzle that one of the other group home residents had helped him make. It was simple, but clearly made with love, and Emma's delighted reaction brought tears to Dad's eyes. For perhaps the first time since his children were small, he was able to give something positive to a member of his family. The visit convinced me that rebuilding our relationship with Dad was worth the emotional complexity it involved. Emma would grow up knowing her grandfather, and Dad would have the chance to experience being a grandparent, roles that mental illness had prevented him from fulfilling. Chapter 12. Understanding forgiveness. Over the following year, as our relationship with Dad continued to develop, I found myself grappling with questions about forgiveness that I'd never fully considered before. The anger I'd carried for decades hadn't simply disappeared with understanding. It had been complicated by empathy, guilt, and new appreciation for the complexity of choices people make when suffering. Forgiving Dad required me to separate the man from his illness, to understand that the person who'd left us wasn't entirely the same as the person who'd stayed away for 30 years. Mental illness had distorted his thinking and convinced him that leaving was an act of love rather than abandonment. But forgiveness also required me to forgive Mom for the deception she'd maintained throughout my life. This was perhaps more difficult than forgiving Dad, because Mom had been fully capable of making different choices and had actively chosen to keep the truth from Jake and me for 3 decades. Most challenging was forgiving myself for the anger and resentment I'd directed toward Dad throughout my adult life. Learning that his absence had been motivated by love rather than selfishness made me feel guilty about the hatred I'd harbored, and the way I'd sometimes used his abandonment as an excuse for my own relationship difficulties. The process of forgiveness wasn't linear or complete. There were days when I felt angry about all the lost time, frustrated with the complexity of rebuilding a relationship with someone who was essentially a stranger, or sad about the grandfather Emma would never know as fully as she might have. But there were also moments of profound connection and healing, when Dad shared memories of Jake and me as children that I'd forgotten, when he expressed pride in the adults we'd become despite his absence, when I watched him interact with Emma and saw the joy that being a grandfather brought him. Forgiveness, I learned, wasn't a destination, but an ongoing process of choosing to prioritize love and connection over hurt and resentment. Chapter 13. The Gift of Truth. 3 years after finding Mom's letter in her toolbox, I can say that discovering the truth about Dad's absence was one of the most difficult and ultimately most valuable experiences of my life. The revelation forced me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about my family, but it also opened the door to relationships and healing I'd never imagined possible. Dad and I now exchange letters monthly and visit twice a year. Our relationship isn't the father-daughter bond that might have developed if he'd been present throughout my childhood, but it's something meaningful nonetheless. He's become part of Emma's life, and she looks forward to visits with Grandpa Robert, who makes wooden toys and tells stories. Jake has also developed his own relationship with Dad, different from mine, but equally valuable. We've learned that Dad is an intelligent, creative person whose illness robbed him of decades, but who never lost his fundamental capacity for love and connection. The reunion led to broader conversations about mental health in our family and community. Emma will grow up with a more nuanced understanding of mental illness than Jake and I had, and I hope this knowledge will help her approach such challenges with empathy rather than fear. Perhaps most importantly, Mom's decision to finally tell the truth, even posthumously, taught me about the importance of honesty in families, even when the truth is painful or complicated. The letter in her toolbox became a final gift, not just the restoration of my relationship with Dad, but a deeper understanding of the sacrifices she'd made. The red toolbox now sits on my kitchen table, no longer filled with tools but with the letters Dad and I have exchanged over the past 3 years. It's become a symbol of the rebuilding process, both the practical work of repairing our relationship and the careful process of constructing something new from broken pieces. Some discoveries change everything, not by revealing something entirely new, but by helping us understand something that was always true but hidden from view. Mom's letter gave me back my father, but more importantly, it gave me a more complete understanding of love, its complexity, its sacrifices, and its ability to endure even when it seems lost forever.